Okay, good morning, everyone, to our last day of the conference today. It's my great pleasure this morning to introduce to you Dave Elder-Vass, who is a reader in sociology at Loughborough University in England. His main interest is in the fields of economic sociology, but he also has a strong interest in epistemological questions in the social sciences. And judging from his last book, I would also classify him, at least to some degree, as an economic anthropologist, although he told me yesterday that this is not the identity he wants to take. But you will see, because his presentation will be actually on his, at least in part, on his latest book, which is called Profit and Gift in the Digital Economy, and which is a book which deals with some of the most important companies in the digital economy, trying to ask what are actually the economic relation and practices that develop out of this new kind of economy, how we can theoretically understand them. And Dave Elder-Vass does this in a very close dialogue with Marx theory, critical dialogue with Marx theory. Now, this book, Profit and Gift in the Digital Economy, has also been just now translated into German, edited by the editing house, published by the editing house here of the Institute für Sozialforschung. So Dave, it's our pleasure to have you here. Your talk today is entitled From Modes of Production to Complexes of Appropriative Practices. Okay, Dave.
Thank you, Jens, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Jens and Wolfgang, for the kind invitation, and thank you all for getting out of bed after a long, hard day yesterday and time to hear us talk this morning. It's fitting, I think, that we should use the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, which is today, by the way. Happy birthday, Karl. To engage with his thinking critically and reflect on its significance for contemporary understanding of our economy today. I think those of us who are interested in diagnosing the pathologies of our contemporary economy and thinking about alternatives really can't avoid engaging with Marx's work, on the one hand as a powerful resource, but also, I'm going to suggest, as a significant obstacle to thinking through our contemporary challenges. Today, or at least in this session, our brief is to engage with the role of technology, and I'm going to do that by advocating an argument from my 2016 book, which Jens just mentioned, which is concerned with the concept of the mode of production. So I'm going to look at that and ask whether, in the light of contemporary technological changes and the impact that they have been having on forms of economic organization, so whether this concept is adequate to our contemporary age. Although I'll then go on to ask whether really it was ever adequate at all, from which I think you can probably deduce that my answer to the first question and also to the second question is going to be no. Sorry for that spoiler. But then I'll go on to talk about at least one way of thinking about a different way of understanding the ontology of economic form. And finally, I'll say a little bit about the political implications of thinking differently about this question. So let me begin by asking what work this concept of mode of production does in Marx, I apologize immediately to all of those who understand Marx better than I do, and I'm sure there's many of you in this room. But I'm going to take a sort of helicopter view of this concept. Mode of production, I think we can safely say, is the central concept in Marx's ontology of economic form. In other words, his way of thinking about the different possible ways and the different actual historical ways in which an economy might be organized. Now, as we all know, he uses this concept to link changes in the forces of production and the relations of production. In particular, the way in which changes in technology create at least opportunities for, or perhaps even a need for, changes in class relationships. You know, while he's not exactly a technological determinist, the core driver of changes in economic form, according to the famous preface of 1859, is technological change and the need for social structures of the economy, social relations, if you like, that enable new forms of productive technology to be exploited. Now, I think probably we're all comfortable with some aspects of the story that results. It's quite clear that in Europe, feudalism was replaced by capitalism, and that the forces involved in that process in some sense reflect that vision that Marx set out in the 1859 preface. We might question whether the same model applies to other economic transitions. Clearly, the model was derived from the transition from feudalism to capitalism and then extended with less evidence, I suspect, to other transitions. But that's not my main concern today. My main concern today is that the concept of mode of production has been so strongly tied to the periodization of history into epochs, each of them dominated by a single mode of production, that has encouraged a monolithic understanding of the economy. Certainly on the left, an understanding that actually has inadvertently come to support a discursive hegemony of the contemporary idea, which also comes from the right, that our economy is exclusively a market economy. But the concept, this is inherent in a way to the concept of mode of production, in that as soon as we see history as a succession of epochs, each of them dominated then by one mode of production, then the implication is that there is always one mode of production that dominates society. And if there are other kinds of economic form that happen to coexist with it, those are always seen as either auxiliary, which is the classic mode of understanding of the household in the Marxist tradition, the household as the kind of handmaiden of capitalism, or as really rather insignificant, which is the classic mode of understanding so-called petty bourgeois production, family and independent business people. As Axel Honneth said yesterday, Marx makes capital the only driving force in society, and I think that beautifully encapsulates the way in which there's an utterly monolithic understanding of the economy built into Marx's ontology of economic form. Now, that I think is highly problematic, and we can start to see why it's problematic by looking at the impact of digital technology in the contemporary period. There can be little doubt that digital technology, and most particularly the internet and developments around the internet in the most recent period, have transformed a whole range of economic processes on a global scale. I mean, it began by transforming kind of back office business processes, but with the rise of the internet, it's also transformed a vast range of, if you like, public-facing economic processes. And in doing so, it has also disrupted, in many cases, not all, but it disrupted in many cases, the social relations of production that existed previously. Most strikingly, and this is a theme I'll develop a little more, there's been substantial decommodification in the digital space. Obviously, there's a great deal of commodity economy occurring in the digital space too, but large elements of the internet platform, for example, are provided for free. The web pages that we load into our browsers every day, the vast majority of those we load in for free. A great deal of the software that we use, browsers like Firefox and Chrome, for example, a lot of the software that's used on the web servers that sit behind the internet is open source software too. So there's a vast amount of the very infrastructure of the internet which is working on a somewhat different economic model than the model of the production of commodities by means of wage labor that is implicit or explicit, shall we say, in Marx's understanding of capitalism. Some of those free services are provided by individuals. Some of us write blogs, for example. If you're interested in mine, it's Materially Social. Have a look at Materially Social. And provide that material for free to other individuals. Some of it is provided for free by capitalist businesses, which raises some interesting conundrums, which I'll come back to in a moment. But in general, these sorts of changes raise two kinds of challenges to a monolithic understanding of modes of production. The first is that capitalism itself seems to be rather more diverse than the usual Marxist model of it as the accumulation of capital through the production of commodities by means of wage labor. When I wrote this foil, my intention was to illustrate that actually some activity in the digital economy does follow the Marxist model. And so I just wrote down the first two examples that came to mind. And then reflecting on this yesterday, I realized that actually neither Amazon nor Uber really does quite fit with the Marxist model. Amazon, of course, operates entirely in the sphere of distribution or circulation, and therefore isn't considered productive at all by conventional Marxism. And Uber, of course, operates by nominally, at any rate, employing independent contractors rather than wage labor. So perhaps they aren't great fits, but there's still plenty of firms that are great fits for the Marxist model. Foxconn is a good example, the Taiwanese company that assembles iPhones in huge factories in China. So there are still elements of capitalism that fit the Marxist model, but alongside that we have a range of others that don't make profit through the production of commodities based on the wage, on the use of wage labor in quite the same way. So Google, I'll come back to talk a bit more about Google later, but both Google and social media firms operate in rather different ways. They make profits by selling something. They're still selling a commodity, advertising, but they're doing it in a way that depends on them giving away services to us, the public, and much of the work, if we can call it that goes into this is either algorithmic, rather than provided by wage laborers, or indeed done by us, the audience. So these don't fit with the conventional model of capitalism. But alongside this, the new technology also opens up possibilities for non-capitalist economic forms, and in particular gift forms of economy, which are vastly more viable in the digital economy than they were before. And the reason for that is that If we give away a material thing, if we give away watches, for example, then every watch that we give away generates a cost of inputs that we have to somehow reproduce. Whereas if we give away entries on our blogs, then the marginal cost of giving it away to one more user is as close to zero as we can reasonably estimate. With the consequence that giving away lots and lots of stuff becomes vastly more viable. And because of that feature of the technology, gifting as a form of organization of the economic process also becomes more viable. And there are vast numbers of cases that I've talked a little bit about open source software. This is software which is written by volunteers, choosing their own work, and made available for free to those people who want to use it. And we all use it every day. You may not realize you're using it, but every time you load a web page, well, every third time you load a web page, you're using a server that has Linux and probably Apache at the back end, which was software written on this model. Peer-to-peer sharing is another nice example. So if I put a music file onto BitTorrent, then I'm giving it to a random assortment of unknown strangers by doing that. So neither the varied forms of capitalism that are developing in the new context, nor the gift forms really fit with the conventional Marxist understanding of mode of production. Capitalism, we might say, is neither singular nor universal in the digital economy. But although the digital transformation gives us new examples of the weaknesses of the concept of mode of production, these are, in a way, merely indications of longer-term flaws in the model. Because other forms of economy have always existed. Of course, the one that is most commonly recognized is the state, which conventional economists kind of recognize the existence of and then say, oh, it's really just an obstruction to the work of the market. And Marxists recognize the existence of and say it's really just a sort of a handmaid of capitalism. The state is clearly a significant alternative form of economy, but the one which has been radically neglected is the gift economy, because the gift economy is enormous in its own right. I mean, the household economy in particular is a gift form of economy in which vast amounts of production are done and vast amounts of transfers take place, but not through the commodity model of exchange. The household form is also huge. And to try and get a handle on how huge the household form is, we can look at a nice paper by Duncan Ironmonger, who actually estimated the size of the household economy in Australia, as it happens. I think he's done the same thing for the US more recently, on the basis of the amount of labor that's expended in the household by comparison with the amount of labor that's expended in the market economy. And he did it in an extremely conservative way. He actually he did perhaps what Marx would have done, valued labor according to its market rate, which meant that the labor of a chief executive might have been valued at 200,000 euros a year, and the value of a person cleaning and cooking in the household was valued at basically minimum wage. And despite that, which rather biases the story in favor of the market economy, Ironmonger found that the household economy in Australia is as big as the market economy in terms of the amount of labor done. So just the household economy is already as large in developed countries as the capitalist economy. In less developed countries, the subsistence economy is often, I think, in the same sort of level, although I don't have the stats to prove it. And beyond that, we have charity, we have blood donation, organ donation, we have all the things that I've talked about in the sphere of the internet. So capitalism, while of course we have to recognize that it's politically dominant in current society and that it's discursively dominant, is not quantitatively dominant in the way that we've often assumed. So that's this coexistence of capitalism with other economic forms is itself a long-term issue. But equally, the idea that capitalism itself takes a monolithic form has never been true either. I know there has been some discussion of this even in the Marxist literature. So, for example, the idea of plantation capitalism has been a feature occasionally in the literature, that in the West Indies and the southern states of the US, capitalist plantation owners, capitalist in the sense that they accumulated capital by investing in the production and sale of commodities, employed slave labor on their plantations. Now, and others in other contexts of employed serf-style labor. And this really questions the assumption that there can be one economic form based on wage labor that we can call capitalism. And of course, if capitalism isn't based on wage labor, then some of the other things that Marx said about capitalism no longer apply. But beyond that, of course, capitalism also accumulates profit through a range of other activities that are not focused on or that primarily derive profit from the employment of wage labor. And there's a whole list of them here. Rent, which Kian talked about yesterday. Commerce in the sense of trading things, buying low and selling high, financial trading, lending money, intellectual property, which again someone mentioned yesterday. These all provide means of accumulating profit in which wage labor, if it's present, is of marginal relevance. And in the end, if it's the case that capitalism isn't characterized by wage labor, then we have to ask what it is characterized by. I think there's an answer. It's not an unpopular one in the literature. It's characterized by production for the sake of accumulating capital. So that gives us a way to identify capitalism, but it rather undermines the idea that capitalism is an instance of a wider type. Capitalism as an instance of the wider type mode of production, because then we would have to have some sort of equivalent principle that identified other modes of production. But actually, I'm aware of no principle that identifies feudalism that's parallel in any sense to the idea that capitalism operates in order to accumulate capital, or slavery for that matter. The only way we have of identifying feudalism is the labor form. The only way we have of identifying slavery is the labor form. And those labor forms are by no means unique to those supposed modes of production. So it becomes very hard to see how there could be such a thing as a mode of production in general. There is capitalism, but is it an example of some wider type on the Marxist model? I suggest that it's not. I suggest that the mode of production is a concept that we need to discard. And that, of course, begs the question of how do we replace this? I suppose it begs the question of whether we do need to replace it at all, and I think that the answer is that we do. We need to have a way of thinking about the ontology of economic form. We need to have a way of thinking about the different ways in which economies can be organized, or better, I think, the different ways in which economic practices can be organized. Because the first important thing that we're going to have to do in this alternative is to recognize that an economic form isn't characteristic of an economy as a whole. Economies are always the sites of many different interacting economic forms. And so the unit of economic form needs to be something smaller. And the unit of economic form that I've proposed in the book is the idea of a complex of appropriative practices. So let me spell that out a little. So first of all, the sort of lowest building block is the concept of practices, which I hope is familiar to most of you. I think of practices as normatively reproduced patterns of interaction. So that includes lots of familiar things like queuing or listening quietly in lectures. And amongst that broad set of practices, there is a subset which we should think of as economic practices, which are those practices that are related to appropriation in the sense of the production and allocation of benefits to actors. So that subset might include things like giving food to our children. You know, there's a practice in which we allocate benefits. It's not commodity exchange, but it's still an economic practice. Selling things to strangers, well, that is commodity exchange. It's another kind of economic practice. Wage labor, another. So we have many economic practices out there, and the characteristic feature of an economic form is that it's a combination of a characteristic set of economic practices, appropriative practices, a complex, as I call it. So, for example, what we might call canonical capitalism, the model that features so strongly in Marx, is a complex of practices that includes wage labor, it includes private ownership and control of the means of production, and sale of the product as a commodity. That's a nice little set of practices. Nice, perhaps, isn't the right word, which fits this model. It fits Marx's model as well, but the other complexes don't. And the other complexes are numerous and varied in contemporary society. You know, both non-capitalist complexes and non-canonical capitalist complexes. And here's where I want to say just a little bit more about Wikipedia and Google as examples. You know, I've worked with examples from the digital economy in the book, and I have chapters about both of these, but we could equally pick examples from the sort of non-digital or pre-digital sectors of the economy. So the first example I want to talk about is Wikipedia. Wikipedia is very much a gift economy complex of appropriative practices. So the practices include these. You know, the product of Wikipedia, those pages of information, are freely available. You know, they're placed on the web where anyone who chooses to can collect and view them. So the product, the transfer of the product, is a gift to Wikipedia's users. The social organization of labor that's required to produce it is a matter of editors volunteering. They take on whatever tasks they choose. If I see a page about, I don't know, the Max Planck Institute, for example, on Wikipedia, then I am free to go in and edit it. I could say what a wonderful thing it is, or which street it's on, or whatever. And of course, if someone else comes along and disagrees with my edit, they can come along and change it. So the editing of Wikipedia is conducted by the voluntary gifting of the editor's labor. It's a wonderfully unalienated form of labor, by the way, because the editor has complete control over what task they choose to do and how they choose to do it, and it's done in the context of a quite strong normative community. So if you look beyond the content pages in Wikipedia, you click on the discussion tab that most of us ignore at the top of the page, you will see the debates within the community about the changes that are made to that particular page. And you will see that those debates are conducted in terms of a set of norms that's largely shared by the Wikipedia editing community, which are also documented as pages, content pages on Wikipedia and maintained through exactly the same processes, which allow for a kind of process of normatively governed consensus achievement. Perhaps I got a bit over-enthusiastic about that. I should stick to my script, shouldn't I? And the other part of this process is that the costs of Wikipedia are funded by donations. So the products, the costs, the labor, all parts of the gift economy. Let me try to be a little briefer about Google. Google, by contrast, is clearly a capitalist complex of appropriative practices. At the bottom, you'll see that it makes profits. It sells advertising as a commodity. But its capacity to do that depends entirely on its capacity to attract an audience. And it attracts an audience by making its product freely available to any of us who wish to use it, whether we're talking about search, email, maps, etc., etc. So there's a hybrid form here of gift and commodity economy. And we could look at the production process too, which is rather different than the capitalist norm. Both the content that Google delivers to us, certainly in the search area and maps area, is delivered by algorithms. There's the only wage labor involved was back at the point where a programmer wrote the code, and it depends on massive collections of data, following the data imperative that I think Marion has written about. So let me move on and to try to summarize what I think of as the benefits of this model of thinking of economic form as complexes of appropriative practices. I think it should be clear from what I've said that by comparison with the mode of production model, this way of thinking allows us to accommodate this profuse coexistence of multiple economic forms within the same economic system. There's no need for us to insist that one form dominates an epoch. It's a historical possibility, but it's not something that is built into the ontology from the beginning. And it allows us to think about the ways in which these different economic forms interact with each other. One form may create the conditions for another to grow. Another may tend to drive another form out of existence. One form may depend on another for its continued existence. Or it may seek to subvert it by hybridizing it, which is something that is an important feature of the changes that we're seeing in the digital economy. So this is a model that allows us to both see and theorize the coexistence of multiple economic forms alongside each other. It's also a model that allows us to accommodate diversity within forms. We can have multiple kinds of capitalism. We can have multiple kinds of gift economy. We can have other kinds of economy that are neither capitalist nor gift forms. And we can have hybrids between two or more of those. So this is a model of the forms of economy which allows us to accommodate both interaction and to accommodate history in a highly flexible way. But I want to close really by talking about the implications of this for politics. One of the difficulties with the mode of production model of economic form is that it encourages us to think that there's only one possible political strategy. If we live in a thoroughly capitalist world, then the only political option for making economic progress is to overthrow capitalism utterly and completely and replace it with X, where X appears to be rather vague, but let's give it a name. Let's call it communism for the sake of argument. And that encourages us dogmatism, not only about the need for that kind of change, but also about what the form of X is going to be. Now, by contrast with that, which I take to be utterly unrealistic and impossible to achieve, by the way, by contrast with that, the model of complexes of appropriative practices already sees our existing economy as a diverse mix of practices and therefore encourages us to conduct economic politics by encouraging some of those practices, perhaps introducing some new ones, seeking to grow them alongside existing economic forms, and at the same time criticizing and seeking to regulate, restrict, or close down some of the other practices in the mix. So rather than seeing economic politics as a choice between heaven and hell, we can see a range of real options, some more desirable than others, with room for debate about what mix is best, and room for multiple strategies of encouraging some aspects and discouraging others. We don't even have to agree with each other what the desirable end point is. We only need to make progress in a positive direction. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to ignore my closing slide because, of course, I've said all these things already, and finish with a piece of crass commercialism by giving you some pictures of the book where you can read more about this argument. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. I see already first hands up. Axel, I saw first, and then Avanza. Please go ahead, Axel.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I agree with your proposition to substitute the concept of modes of production by practices of appropriation, but the question to me is what can be seen empirically by what you have suggested. In a nutshell, I would say your argument has mean that digital economy or digitalization allows us to see that capitalism has always been much more diverse, or let's say complex, as an at least orthodox Marxist view suggests. And I'm asking myself, and that's my question to you, whether this insistence on similarities isn't blurring the specificities of digital capitalism. Because what I propose to see, or what to me seems to be on the way, is rather a commodification of gift exchange in the digital economy. There are a few exceptions. Wikipedia, maybe. But altogether, we are not really getting our informations or services or immaterial goods for free, since we are paying with our data. And what we are experiencing is a double indirect exchange. In a way, we are practicing a perverse form of gift exchange in as much as it is not an exchange of equivalences. But on a second change, we do pay with the information involuntarily given that companies like Google or Amazon or whoever are collecting. So I suggest focus more on the differences between digital capitalism and capitalism as such, instead of proposing that capitalism has always been more diverse than it seems.
Please.
Thank you. Yes, so digital capitalism commodifying gift exchange. I mean, absolutely, there's a strong element of that. I mean, I did say, I think briefly in the presentation, that one of the issues in the digital space is that capitalist businesses are seeking to subvert the digital model, seeking to adapt it for their purposes. And there's no doubt about that. Google is an absolutely clear example of that. When Google was founded, it was a search business, a search enterprise, maybe we should say, and it operated by giving away search and getting nothing back in return. This is an intriguing business model, quite common in the digital economy, where companies operate at a massive loss and until they can find a way of making money. And of course, eventually they found a way of making money, which was to introduce the smartest advertising that the commercial world has yet seen. And so they transformed their initial gift model into a commodity-based model. And equally, there's a tendency for firms to try to shape gift models to the pursuit of profit. So in the space of encyclopedias, when Jimmy Wales set up his encyclopedia to start with, it was intended as a commercial business, but he abandoned that fairly quickly. But others have come along who've tried to replicate the Wikipedia model as a commercial business. And there are some spaces in which non-commercial businesses have a competitive advantage, if we can use that phrase, in the gift space, because people trust the information from Wikipedia more than they trust the information from commercial encyclopedia providers, because they know that it's not distorted in order to meet the needs of advertisers. So there may be spaces where gift models actually have an advantage over commercial models. But equally, there are many spaces where, as you say, commercial businesses are trying to bend aspects of gift to their purposes. Sorry, I spent too long on that question, because you also talked about paying with our data. One of the chapters of my book is called "Does Google Give Gifts?" And it's a very interesting question. In a way, the services that they provide to us are provided to us for free. In principle, there are ways of getting those services for free. You can still do a Google search, for example, when you've masked your IP address and failed to log into any service so that they don't know anything about you. The only thing that they always know, and they know by necessity, is what the search term is that you've typed in. I'm not sure that counts as your data, but obviously they are trying to accumulate more and more data on us. And it's a difficult question, I think. Are we really paying for those services with our data, or are these two gifts? Or is the material that Google provides to us a gift, and the material that we provide something else which is neither a gift nor a payment? And I tend more towards the last point of view. But it's a technical argument, and what really matters is that Google are making a lot of money by giving us stuff for free.
Aaron Saar is next, and please try to be brief in response and brief in questions as well, please.
Well, thank you, Dave. As you know, I like your book a lot, but one problem I've mentioned to you before remains. So, appropriative practices allocate economic benefits, and they are arranged in complexes. And somehow, what interests most people working with the term capitalism is, for some reason, all these complexes are arranged in a way that in the end, most of these benefits are in the hand of a few. So when you identify capitalism as a type of appropriative complexes, the effect that they all are arranged in a certain way is kind of accidental. So it's not a feature of a system anymore. It's like, well, for some reason, in the end, all the benefits are at the top 1%. And so would you share this interpretation of your argument? And don't you need a theoretical term similar to mode of production to explain why they are arranged in this way?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I have two comments. Two brief comments. One is that I don't think it's true that they all end up with the benefits accumulating in the hands of the few. I mean, they may all end up with the benefits unequally distributed, but if you look at the household, where no doubt the benefits are unequally distributed, the model of who accumulates benefits is very different from the capitalist economy. Now, within the capitalist economy, yes, I accept the model, the benefits accumulate in the hands of the few. But there's nothing that I'm saying which prevents us from analyzing that. I think the point is that I'm providing a framework within which we can analyze a variety of different forms and the features of each of those forms and the consequences that those features have. And clearly the dominant feature of the capitalist family of economic forms is that it's devoted to the accumulation of capital by those who are the owners of the business concerned. And so capitalism as a class of forms, maybe say a family of forms to avoid misusing that word, does fit with the model that you've described, and that's perfectly compatible with the approach that I'm taking.
So now behind Aaron, that's...
I like your idea of practices very much, but honestly, it is a little painful for me that you ignore the Marxist debates of the last 50 years completely, and that the debate about the regulation school and the efforts to build intermediate models of the modes of production, which introduces institutions, power relations, and so on, and they draw a more nuanced picture of the history of capitalism. I think then you could build your model in another way, and you don't need to argue in such a way against Marx. This is one thing, and the other thing is, Aaron mentioned it, I think even the digital economy, the 5 big companies, are a good example of what Marx called in Capital about the tendency of monopolization. So they concentrated a huge amount of power, of commodity power and market power. This is the first thing. And the second thing is, are you considering about time in the evolution of the digital economy? Are you really sure that we won't pay for Facebook in the next year? That they change their business model from a gift model to a model of paying consumers and so on, so that the commodification is coming in the next years? Thank you.
Yes, I mean, the regulation school is interesting. I've mentioned it briefly in the book. So Alietta does some interesting work on early American capitalism, for example. And he does one of the things that that I've suggested is difficult for the mode of production approach, which is that he looks at the relationship between the kind of subsistence economy and the capitalist economy, arguing that the capitalist economy was in its early development and the US was dependent on the subsistence economy. But then he goes straight back to saying it's all about capitalism. And that's my problem, really, that in the end, you know, he fits with that Marxist model that, you know, capital is the only driver of what matters in the economy. In terms of Google monopolization, absolutely, Google is the biggest monopoly the world has ever seen. You know, it's the dominant provider of search in all but about half a dozen countries of the world. You know, with over an 80% market share in many of those companies, if you can call it a market share when you're giving something away. Digital technology makes it easier to become a monopolist across a massive geographical scale. You know, it's no longer necessary to set up, you know, factories and distribution operations and marketing operations around the world. You just need a website. So monopolization is you know, remains a major issue. And time, well, who knows? Perhaps we will end up paying for Facebook, but I don't think that conflicts with the larger model that I'm describing here. And nor does it mean that there won't continue to be free alternatives.
Okay, last question.
If I were to summarize my point, I would do it in two statements. So the first is that we've seen a massive creation of a rentier-taking economy. That's what Google and Amazon and all of that is about. So we need to rethink the mode of production concept in the light of the rentier-taking economy rather than the gift, I would say. So from gift to rentier-taking. And the second one is 200 years after Marx's birth, there are many more proletarians in the system than ever. And, you know, we've seen a 3- or 4-fold increase in number of proletarians since the 1970s. China. So at this moment to say that mode of production might not work in a Marxian way is, I think, closing your eyes for a lot of important things.
Okay, well, let me take the second one first. I mean, clearly, I did mention Foxconn. In some of their factories, if factories is the right word, in China, they employ 300,000, 400,000 people in one factory. Yeah. So yes, there are huge numbers of proletarians. So I'm not suggesting we discard the concept of capitalism, but that's a little different than the argument that I'm making, which is that characterizing capitalism as a mode of production amongst other modes of production, and as a kind of unitary phenomenon, I think are highly problematic, and the existence of hundreds of thousands of people in a factory in China doesn't really affect that argument, I think. I haven't got so much to say about the rentier economy. I haven't thought it through thoroughly yet, so if you don't mind, I'm going to duck that question. Sorry.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave.
Thank you.
And we continue right away with the presentation of Marion Fourcade. Marion, I will also say.
Is it possible to? Oh, yeah. Sorry, forgot.
So Marion and me, we know so well that she doesn't even expect that I would introduce her, but it is my great pleasure to do so. So Marion Fourcade is a professor of sociology at the University of California at Berkeley. And she is one of the most renowned economic sociologists internationally. And I would say, I mean, in very broad strokes with an interest especially on the interfaces between the economy and culture, yeah, and a work which is not entirely uninformed by another great French sociologist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu, yeah, in this one. In 2009, Marion Fourcade published her widely acclaimed book, Economists and Societies, which is a study of the development of the field of economics in 3 countries, France, Great Britain, and the United States during the 20th century. And the field of economics is actually still, I mean, one of the important research fields of Marion. I just remind of a paper that also got lots of attention that she published a few years ago under the title "The Superiority of Economists," which found, I mean, quite a bit of attention, not only among sociologists but also among economists. Otherwise, Marion is interested in topics like, for instance, how classifications, yeah, in wine markets come about, or very interesting papers on a research project that looked at damage compensation in environmental disasters. But more recently, Marion's interest also goes into the question of technological developments and the significance of technological developments, especially associated with the digital revolution, and how to understand from a sociological perspective these developments. So the talk today is exactly on this topic, entitled "The Rise of the Artificially Intelligent Classes." Marion, please, the floor is yours.
The PDF? Okay, perfect. Thank you. Dankeschön. Okay. Okay. Thank you. All right, so I disappear a little bit behind this podium, but thank you very much, Jens, for the kind introduction. I'm going to tread actually much of the same Marxist ground as David, but with a slightly different take. And perhaps actually in this presentation I am kinder to Marx. Maybe that's because it's his birthday today. So for Karl Marx, social classes and the ideological formations they give rise to are intimately linked to the evolution of technology, or more specifically to the development of what he called productive forces, which refers both to the physical objects which men act upon nature and to the skills, knowledge, experience, etc. they mobilize in the process. He stated the point clearly in a famous passage of The Poverty of Philosophy. Quote, "Social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. In acquiring new productive forces, men change their mode of production. And in changing their mode of production, in changing the way of earning their living, they change all their social relations. The hand mill gives you the society with a feudal lord, the steam mill, society with the industrial capitalist. The same men who establish their social relations in conformity with the material productivity produce also principles, ideas, and categories in conformity with their social relations." End quote. As productive forces expand their inexorable reach, new social formations emerge, new classes, whose irresistible rise strains existing social relations, sometimes to the point of explosion. Thus, the bourgeoisie, born from the Industrial Revolution but shackled by feudal society, ousted the aristocracy in an eruption of violence. Similarly, the working class, born from the rise of wage labor and of the factory age, will overthrow bourgeois power in the coming communist revolution. Note that for Marx and his followers, the success of communism itself was dependent on technological progress too. Lenin famously defined it as, quote, Soviet government plus the electrification of the whole country. He was firmly convinced that only with large-scale infrastructures and, quote, electricity-conscious masses would communism one day surpass industrial capitalism. So what are we to make of that today, that program? Historian Yuval Harari writes in Homo Deus that if, and I quote, if Marx came back to life today, he would probably urge his few remaining disciples to devote less time to reading Das Kapital and more time to studying the internet and the human genome, end quote. Marx would have remarked that in the 21st century, the real value to capital of man and woman is less and less located in their labor power, and certainly less and less in their physical body, but it is located in something that is much more intimate, something perhaps closer to their species being. The power of their personal data, the millions of bits of information about who they are deep down and how they relate to one another. Had he lived today, Marx would have seen the traces of old-fashioned Entfremdung, alienation, in the sucking up of the most intimate aspects of the self through addictive algorithms that increasingly mediate people's relationships to everything from their jobs to their physical being to their fellow humans. He would have identified new forms of surplus value generation in the unpaid, though compensated, as we just discussed, click work that billions of digital users do as they go about their online lives. And he would have wondered what kinds of class formations and associated ideologies this new mode of accumulation might give rise to. So I'll take each of these points in turn. Alienation, surplus value or exploitation, if you will, primitive accumulation, and class formation. Marx wrote about the mortification of the body and the ruining of the mind in the industrial production process. But at least the body left the machine behind at the door of the factory. Not so with digital capitalism, when machines have become so tightly integrated with physical and mental selves that they solicit them continuously, identify voices and facial features, and record unconscious behavioral patterns. Many aspects of our cognition and perception, from our sense of direction to our memory, from our intelligence to our self-feelings, are routinely externalized to immediately accessible devices that function like actual extensions of our minds and increasingly of our bodies. And this is a point that philosophers have made in the mind extension thesis. It's a famous paper by Clark and Chalmers. So we have come to see ourselves as longitudinal databases that perform incrementally better or worse on a series of indicators that come to us ready-made, be they in our phones, in our Fitbits, or our web browser. These externalized versions of ourselves not only dictate what we should aspire to, who we can and cannot be, but they also forcefully bend the possibilities for self-actualizations to the demand of the digital system. Perhaps we do feel emotionally better when someone we do not know befriends us on Facebook. So we actually become that kind of self that, the machine.
Your earring is kind of clicking against the microphone. Maybe you could take it off.
Okay, I'm taking off my earrings. All right. I'll take off both of them. I don't want to look like a pirate. Okay. So, I continue. Perhaps we do feel emotionally better when someone we do not know befriends us on Facebook, right? We become that person that Facebook tells us we should be, And perhaps we even feel physically better when our phone tells us that we have walked 10,000 steps, whether we have actually done so. And this is something that came out recently on Twitter. It's a little device, it's a little cradle for an iPhone. It was seen at the, as you can see, seen at a Harbin restaurant. It's a Sweden cradle. I'm told to cheat the 10,000 steps a day test and qualify for health insurance discounts, presumably while I relax, eat, drink more, and have another cigarette. So, you know. The point is that it is the machine that it's funny, but it's extremely sad too. And I'll get to that point. It is a machine that determines for us who the real self is. It is a peculiar feeling to discover that some digital companies know us better than we know ourselves, in a sense of, you know, they know us better in a sense of being better able to predict our behavior. That they subject us to continuous psychocomputational experiments, and that the information gained thereby is actually leveraged for profit, part a new form of accumulation that Shoshana Zuboff has termed surveillance capitalism. More recently, one fallout from the Cambridge Analytica scandal is that a window has opened up for people to finally be allowed to peek, at least people in the United States. In Europe, you have better, you know, you've had better access to these kinds of possibilities. We are finally able to peek into our digital data doubles as dissected and repackaged for the purpose of an advertising company. Here is, for instance, my Facebook data. So you can see these are all the folders. You know, they have my payment history, photos, posts, all my activities, my likes and reactions, my location history, marketplace. You know, all of this is, so you won't get to see what's inside, of course, but you know, you can now actually download your Facebook history. And then, you know, this is my Uber, and you can see that I have a rating of 4.86 as a customer of Uber. As you know, Uber writes both customers and drivers. So it's a very peculiar experience. We may experience that confrontation with the thick personal files compiled by Facebook, or the more single-minded personal rating produced by Uber, as a feeling of estrangement in a Marxist sense. We did not choose any of it, and yet it is here, facing us and exerting power over us. As Jaron Lanier puts it, quote, when developers of digital technologies design a program that requires you to interact with a computer as if it were a person, they ask you to accept in some corner of your brain that you might also be conceived of as a program. Our own life has now been recomposed for us as so many severable chunks ready-made for efficient sorting and slotting. Paraphrasing Marx, we could say, the more the digital user puts into the computer, the less he belongs to himself. That thick file, that rating now has the potential to follow us around and to re-entangle itself in our lives at important moments by irrefutably defining who we truly are. And in many ways, the process is similar to the one described by Irving Goffman in Asylums. The history of people's interactions with the system may be called upon at any moment to generate a certain treatment, you know, for instance, a set of ads, to induce compliance, or simply to mortify. Just a few days ago, I had an online interaction with the company that supplies me with cloud services. And then I received 3 emails reminding me to rate the employee who answered my query, who was probably working from an uncomfortable cubicle in the Utah desert or somewhere in the global south. Her job depended on my satisfaction. And actually, as a side note, my own willingness to participate in the rating economy was probably a matter of some sort of numerical record, too. So, I don't know. You know, if you know anything about sort of the mail sorting programs, you know, whether you click, actually, whether you open your mail is actually being rated by the program that handles it. So, for instance, all of my mails at Berkeley is being, you know, I'm being rated as, you know, to whether I'm a good mail opener or not. So, you know, I suppose that the companies are also, you know, that sent me this mail about this poor employee was probably rating me too. But the point for her is that it was not simply the product of her labor that was estranged from her in the process, it was her whole social persona. And this process of estrangement, in turn, was critical to a double process of accumulation. The accumulation deriving from her doing her job, but also that deriving from her, and incidentally my, production of valuable and potentially detachable pieces of information about some sort of underlying character about each of us. Now, Marx conceived of the process of exploitation as the extraction of surplus labor, whether physical or mental labor, beyond its cost of reproduction. The modern form, however, is the site of a secondary process of value extraction, data about laborers, which feeds back into the primary process of exploitation by allowing, for instance, for wages to be adjusted to measure differences between individuals. But this secondary logic of value generation does not even need actually active wage laborers. Much of the surveillance, as we just heard, much of the surveillance that takes place in the digital economy isn't the byproduct of a wage relation. It is the byproduct of a deliberate give-to-get exchange where apparently free services, and you can think, David just presented that, everything from search to cloud computing to Google Maps are the open fields from which the ever-growing bits of data will be harvested. Now, many of the people I have been interviewing in Silicon Valley spontaneously use the vocabulary of contract to describe the relationship between online users and firms. As Jake Ford, and these are all pseudonyms, founder and CEO of EagleNet, said in his response to an interview question, quote, "Hey, dealbag, you're getting it for free. They have to make money somehow." End quote. And money they all made. Facebook, in its early days, was crawling with all kinds of gimmicky apps and games whose sole purpose was to unlock the trove of personal data that the company gave them access to. Facebook's own purpose in these deals was to get a following of loyal developers producing APIs, which are the application programming interfaces, that would make the platform more attractive. Quote, add functionality to it, end quote, as one interviewee politely put it. The psychological test that unlocked the Facebook data trove for what later became Cambridge Analytica is but one example, but there are 1,000 like this. I'm going to give you one. The buddy poke. For instance, in the early days of Facebook, a mind-boggling 65 million people installed the buddy poke application. It was a little thing that allowed you to, if you had a friend on Facebook, you could poke them, okay? This, in turn, gave the company access to possibly the entire network of Facebook users. So today, the runaway data that we talk about every day, that we see in the news every day, is the product of these moments of deadly symbiosis. Companies using their tech ecosystems to grow, and tech ecosystems feeding on companies to get access to personal data. It turns out that many corporations made the same Faustian bargains with each other as they made with their own users. And actually, I prefer the term Faustian bargain to gift exchange for a reason that I can talk about more at length later. So Buddy Poke looked free to Facebook. It was sort of adding something fun to the platform, drawing in all these teenagers. It looked free to Facebook the way Facebook looked free to us. But of course, Buddy Poke was just practicing a form of secondary exploitation of the very same people, where free time, leisure, was turned into a productive endeavor in a manner not unlike that described by Wolfgang yesterday. Now, of course, what Facebook gains from each user individually is very little. But seen collectively, user-generated data is precious. The most obvious, immediate use is for target advertising. We just saw that. Siphoning value out of the fine-grained knowledge of people's taste or emotional states. This is how Cambridge Analytica monetized its Facebook data, building its business model on peddling the precise differentiation and matching of political message to personality type. But this is the only visible part of the data economy iceberg. The immersed part is far more significant. The data serves as training ground for all kinds of derivative products. Help Google with its translation algorithm, and soon the company is putting millions of professional translators out of business. correct your own transcriptions of oral dictation, and you will provide companies with free training data too. Tag your own photos, and Apple makes giant steps in facial recognition. Click on the 10th rather than the first link on your Google search return, and the next time it will be optimized to better fit your preferences. Facebook revealed just a few days ago that it too had repurposed its Instagram users' billions of images to train its artificial intelligence systems. Extensive, often intensive incorporation is the nerve of the web analytics war. And this is what corporations euphemistically call user engagement, right? But it essentially means addiction. So it is through addiction, that you help people produce more and more data. Today, in 2018, the behemoths of the digital economy, what Jaron Lanier calls the siren servers, who lure people into their online ecologies with cool features and seemingly free candy, look vulnerable. Mark Zuckerberg, founder of Facebook, had to express his contrition for past mistakes and subject himself to a ritualistic public degradation ceremony, and I mean by that a congressional hearing. The European Union has passed a strict law that requires user consent for new data collection, the GDPR. As an aside note, though, let us not forget that framing the issue of data privacy as one of individual choice plays into the hands of the existing data behemoth. Their monopoly on what has already been acquired is largely safe, and so is the technological lead that they have derived from this monopoly. So perhaps we should look at what I think is the real frontier in the primitive accumulation process. The advertising-driven business model is moving fast towards an artificial intelligence-driven business model, with Google in the lead. Data monopolies have enabled the development of a new generation of proprietary algorithms that are revolutionizing the work process, the calculation of risk, and relations between people. Perhaps the most visible, and of course all kinds of goods like, as I said earlier, translation, transcription, facial recognition, image recognition, and so on and so forth. Perhaps the most visible consequence of the deep learning revolution in artificial intelligence is that human intermediaries, including incidentally programmers and data scientists, are increasingly dispensable in the design of optimized systems and value extraction mechanisms. As algorithms begin to self-train, actually Google in January unveiled an auto machine learning system, and AIs build AIs, the perspective arises of a capital that largely begets more capital without any mediation by labor. So, MCM prime becomes MM prime. In 1950, the American mathematician Norbert Wiener, widely credited with the founding of cybernetics, published a pithy little book titled The Human Use of Human Beings. Wiener, like Marx, was a keen observer of technology. But for him, the promise of the machine was a contrary of alienation. Robots were instead the condition of human flourishing and emancipation, the ultimate relief from drudgery. Wiener announced the rise of the fully automated factory and the end of industrial labor, which he thought was merely 25 years away. Now, the timing of that prediction was obviously widely off the mark, but the trend wasn't. And, you may have heard about this, this paper that made a little bit of the rounds. Thomas will know. It's, the paper by Acemoglu and Restrepo, which is looking at the impact of the introduction of robots on US local labor markets. And you can see that the impact of the introduction of robots, this is by level of education. So you can see that essentially the impact is negative, across the board, across all levels of education of the workforce. Now, of course, today automation is becoming once again, a moral panic. And I will not enter the debate of the likely impact on jobs, which is all over the place, because you have people who say, artificial intelligence will still, will allow us to create new kinds of jobs, and then you have people who say, 51% of the jobs in the US are going to disappear. And actually, both could be true. You could have a lot of jobs disappearing and a new kinds of jobs being created. But suffice to say that the social commotion is going to be really important. Entire occupations, from truck drivers to legal assistants to radiologists to perhaps teachers like us, are contemplating the possibility of a rapid descent into the dustbins of history. Even the creative professions are not immune to this technological upheaval. Artificial intelligences today can compose symphonies and choreographies. They already write movie scripts or poetry. They paint and they sculpt. They design industrial parts, as you can see right here. You can see an industrial part designed by an artificial intelligence look a lot like a piece of your own skeleton. It looks much more organic than what human beings are used to making. Artificial intelligences also support the movement of bodies that do not move anymore. They speak, decode emotions, and serve as conversational partners, even psychotherapists of sorts. They diagnose patients and repair tissues. They are being taught ethics and philosophy, and they increasingly look like us. All of this has led some prophets to announce the coming irrelevance of man. Of course, all the more since the machines can kill on their own too, as they might one day decide, and they might one day decide that they have no use for us. And of course, this is the most catastrophic predictions. But I was at an artificial intelligence conference last weekend, and a prominent AI researcher, and perhaps the most prominent AI researcher in the world, soberly remarked, in spite of our own best efforts, it is possible humans are going to be enfeebled as a species. The other possibility, of course, is the exact opposite, that the rise of artificial intelligence is going to augment, not to enfeeble humans as a species, but actually to augment them. And of course, this is what all of the companies are telling you today. Certainly enough military strategists and industry captains believe in this future that public and private capital is flowing towards supporting its realization. Last year, Elon Musk, founder of Tesla and SpaceX, unveiled a new company, Neuralink, which ambitions to implant computer interfaces directly into the human brain. There it is. Directly into the human brain in order to enhance its cognitive and computational capabilities. The Guardian recently reported that, quote, Facebook has been hiring neuroscientists for an undisclosed project at its secretive hardware division, Building 8, end quote. What we have to reckon with, I think, analytically, is the rise of a new class whose power is rooted in the ownership and use of data-enabled artificial intelligence, whether it comes in the form of sorting algorithms, new generations of robots, or brain enhancement devices whose neuroinformational output will presumably feed back into the coffers of their designers, the same way that today personal data flows back to the servers of digital firms. From the point of view of social organization, the development of productive forces, as briefly laid out here, has two main implications. First, the logic of technological development points towards the increasing concentration of capital in the hands of a small number of owners who will have the infrastructural power and financial means to make AI work for them. Second, the same logic points towards the increasing concentration of AI itself and other technologies, such as genetics-based enhancement, in the physical body of a small elite who will have the knowledge and the financial means to perform its own augmentation. Third, the cultural and political implications are far-reaching. Feudalism relied on the ideologies of honor and loyalty to culturally cement its social order, according to Marx. Industrial capitalism mobilized the twin ideologies of liberalism, freedom on the one hand and equality on the other, in its effort to march the working masses into factories by means of the labor contract. But what will the social cultural formation associated with artificially intelligent capitalism look like? Historian Yuval Harari foresees the rise of a new axis of social differentiation between a class of superhumans who will be outfitted with biotechnical self-enhancing prosthetics and a mass of useless individuals in whose health and well-being stakes will now have fewer incentives to invest. The dividing line in that society may thus be the general usefulness to the system, as assessed by opaque, automated algorithm, and as enabled or not by self-augmentation technology. That is, you would have, whether you're useful or not will become actually the most important dividing line. Perhaps, of course, this scenario seems very far-fetched, And I'm sorry, I'm taking some pleasure in sort of the, talking about the designs that I hear about, in Silicon Valley. But maybe it's not so far-fetched. If we realize, for instance, that moral worth and usefulness are very much the way Chinese companies and government institutions have justified the unveiling of the country's social credit system, which is a series of algorithmic designs that score individuals on everything from their financial discipline to the quality of their social network to the morality of their behavior. And if that's the case, if morality, moral worth, if you will, becomes the new sort of means of moral worth as measured by algorithm, if that becomes the new means of social stratification, then this future I've been talking about might actually take place. The city of Rongchen in China is a pioneer in this matter, the social credit system. Answering a journalist from the Süddeutsche Zeitung who has come to inquire about the city's social credit system, a civil servant says, quote, "We want to civilize people," end quote. He proudly cites the founding document of the Office of Honesty of the city of Rongchen. The purpose of the system will be to, quote, "allow the trustworthy to roam everywhere under heaven while making it hard for the discredited to take a single step," end quote. Thus perhaps, that perhaps is the kind of social system that our current state of productive forces seems to enable. And, this is why, I've sort of stuck with a fairly, conventional Marxist analysis of sort of mode of production here. Trying to draw out, the dominant logic. But whether that is in our future, we cannot say for sure. That depends on so much health. As Marx wisely said, and perhaps as Thomas would say too, the point is not to interpret the world, it is to change it.